All right, today we're tackling one of the biggest, most complex financial experiments happening on the planet, carbon markets. We're talking about a global attempt to use the power of the market to fight climate change. So let's dive right in.
And when I say big, I mean wow. According to the World Bank, revenues from carbon pricing just hit a staggering, record-breaking $104 billion in 2023. This isn't some niche idea anymore, folks. It's a massive global economic force.
But a number that big brings up a really simple question, right? How does this even work? I mean, how exactly do you put a price on something as invisible as a puff of smoke, a ton of carbon dioxide?
Well, at its very core, it's all about this one simple principle. Carbon pricing is just a tool that attaches a real dollar cost to pollution. The whole idea is, if it costs you money to pollute, you're going to have a really powerful financial reason to, pollute less.
So to see how this plays out in the real world, let's take a look at the pioneer here, the European Union. They built the world's very first and still the largest carbon market. It's kind of the blueprint everyone else is watching.
And this isn't some newfangled experiment. The EU's emissions trading system, or ETS, has been up and running since 2005. And over the years, it's constantly been changing, getting bigger, setting tougher goals, and just this year, it brought the entire maritime shipping industry into the system. That's huge.
The way it works is based on this idea of cap and trade. Let me break it down. First, the EU sets a hard limit, a cap, on the total pollution allowed from over 10,000 big factories and power plants. Then, it gives out or sells allowances to these companies. One allowance equals 1 ton of CO2. Now here's the cool part, step 3, the trade. If a company gets innovative and cuts its pollution, it can sell its leftover allowances to another company that's struggling. And here's the kicker. Every single year, the EU lowers that cap, which makes those allowances harder to get and more expensive. That pressure forces everyone to get greener.
So does it actually work? Well, this number kind of speaks for itself. This is a mandatory market. You don't have a choice. You have to play. And by 2023, the EU system had helped slash emissions from all those sectors by about 47% compared to when it first started. That is a pretty significant drop.
Okay, now let's completely switch gears. We're going to go from this established, mandatory system in Europe to a totally different story, an emerging and way more complex market taking root in Indonesia.
Indonesia's potential here is just immense. Why? Because it's home to the world's third largest tropical rainforest. These incredible ecosystems are basically natural carbon sponges, which could make Indonesia a superpower in creating carbon credits from nature.
But here's the big difference. The market developing in Indonesia is not mandatory like the EU's. It's what we call a voluntary carbon market, or a VCM. Companies aren't forced to join. Instead, they choose to buy carbon credits to help meet their own climate promises, those net zero goals you hear about. But trying to build a market like this from the ground up is really, really hard. I mean, you've got constantly changing rules that make investors nervous. The national system for even tracking these credits, well, it's not as transparent as what you see internationally. There are also really serious questions about whether the money will ever make it to the local and indigenous communities who actually live in and protect these forests. And to top it all off, the forestry projects themselves, which make up most of Indonesia's potential, aren't even fully cleared to trade yet. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It really gets to the core tension of the whole thing. Is this just about companies making an economic transaction? Or is there a real discussion happening about climate justice and the rights of indigenous people who are on the front lines? That's the big question. And look, this isn't just an Indonesia problem. These challenges point to a much bigger global issue that all voluntary carbon markets are facing right now, a real crisis of credibility and trust.
And right at the heart of this credibility debate is the difference between two kinds of carbon credits. On one hand, you have avoidance credits. These come from projects that say they prevented emissions, like protecting a forest that was supposedly going to be chopped down. They're easier to create, but it's really hard to prove that the forest was definitely going to be destroyed. On the other hand, you have removal credits. These come from projects that physically pull carbon out of the air. Think planting new forests or using fancy direct air capture machines. They're much more scientific and easier to measure, but they're also way harder to come by and a lot more expensive.
Because of all the criticism around those avoidance credits, what we're seeing is a big shift. A lot of major corporations are now putting their money into the more expensive, but more verifiable, removal credits. Why? They're trying to avoid being accused of greenwashing. making big climate claims that just don't stand up to scrutiny.
So, where does this all leave us? Well, the whole world of carbon markets is pretty much at a crossroads. It's facing these huge challenges, but it's also changing and evolving at an incredible pace.
What's becoming really clear is that the old, sharp line between the mandatory EU-style markets and the voluntary Indonesia-style markets, well, that line is starting to get pretty blurry. The two worlds are actually starting to come together.
And a huge reason for this is something called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Think of it like the official rulebook for creating a truly global, standardized carbon market. It's what allows countries to actually trade emission reductions with each other to help meet their national climate goals. It could bring some much-needed order and integrity to the whole system.
And this is where it gets really high stakes for a country like Indonesia. If you look at this chart, you see the gap between its climate goals and what it's projected to emit. But then, look at its potential supply of carbon credits. It's enormous. If Indonesia can just solve its credibility problems and get in line with these new international standards, it could sell that massive surplus. And the potential value? As you can see at the bottom, we're talking about over $15 billion by 2030. The incentive to get this right is just massive.
And that really brings us to the final $100 billion question, doesn't it? These carbon markets are a massive, planet-wide experiment. But as they grow, we have to keep asking ourselves, are we actually building a system that cuts emissions and creates a more just world? Or are we just inventing a really complicated new way to pass the buck? The answer to that is going to shape the future of climate finance for decades to come.